Okay, let's dive right in. I think we all have this kind of sanitized stained glass window view of the biblical patriarchs.
Mm-hmm. Solemn men, long beards, the whole thing.
Exactly. Pious women looking up at the sky. But the text we're looking at today, Genesis chapter 30, it completely shatters that image.
Oh, it does.
If you really read it, it feels less like a sermon and more like, I don't know, a high-stakes corporate takeover mixed with a really messy reality show.
That is the perfect way to describe it. It's incredibly messy. I mean, if you just stripped away the ancient names, you're left with a story about bitter sibling rivalry,
Yeah.
surrogate mothers being used as pawns, and
And trades involving what? Narcotic plants?
narcotic plants, yeah. And then these deceptive business practices that they'd land everyone in court today.
It's just so intense. And looking at the sources we've pulled for this, we're talking everything from commentaries like Truly Random Verse to sermon notes on playing God, plus some heavy archaeological data. Our mission here is to figure out what is actually happening.
Right, because on the surface, it just looks like total chaos.
Right.
But the goal, I think, is to see how that very human chaos interacts with, well, with divine order.
The scheming versus sovereignty.
That's the central tension. Everyone in this chapter is trying to control things they can't control. Fertility, love, wealth.
Okay, so let's set the scoreboard for anyone just dropping in. We're in the middle of Jacob's story. He has two wives, the sisters Rachel and Leah. And coming out of the last chapter, the situation is, well, it's incredibly lopsided.
It's a pressure cooker. You've got Leah, the older sister, who Jacob was tricked into marrying. She's already had 4 sons. Four. And then you have Rachel, the one he actually wanted, the one he loves.
Right.
And she has 0. And you have to understand, in the ancient Near East, this isn't just about personal sadness. This is about your status, your security, your entire future.
And Rachel just hits a breaking point. The chapter opens with her demanding of Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die."
I mean, just feel the weight of that. Her entire existence in her mind is tied to this. She isn't just unhappy. She feels like her life is over.
And Jacob's response is, well, it's not exactly empathetic, is it? He just snaps back at her.
No, he shouts theology at her. Am I in the place of God? Which, is technically true.
Right. He's not wrong, but he's not very kind.
Not at all. It's certainly not a model of pastoral care. He's admitting he's powerless, but Rachel doesn't want to hear that. So if plan A, natural conception, doesn't work, she immediately goes to plan B.
Which is to give her servant, Bilhah, to Jacob.
Yes.
And we have to pause here because to a modern listener, that sounds just wild. I can't get pregnant, so here, sleep with my maid.
Was this just Rachel being erratic?
It sounds wild, but this is where those Nutsi and Murray tablets are so important. They are these ancient legal contracts from that exact time period.
Okay.
And they spell out this exact scenario. It was a legal custom. If a high-status wife was barren, she could provide a surrogate, and the children would be legally hers. So she's not making this up. She's following the cultural playbook.
She's following the playbook, and it's actually a key detail that points to how old this text is. This practice had mostly died out by, say, 500 BC. The fact that the story hinges on it tells us it's preserving a really ancient, accurate memory.
Okay, so Bilhah has a son, and Rachel names him Dan, but then the second son is born, and she names him Naphtali. And this name is something else.
It's so telling. The name Naphtali comes from the Hebrew word for wrestling, and Rachel says it outright. With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed.
She literally names the kid my feud.
Exactly. This child's existence is a point on the scoreboard against her sister. It's a zero-sum game. For her to win, Leah has to lose. It's what some theologians call a fallen anthropology. You find your worth by looking sideways, not up.
And of course, Leah sees this, realizes she stopped having kids for a minute, and thinks, okay, my turn.
The arms race just escalates. She gives her maid, Zilpah, to Jacob. Zilpah has 2 more sons, Gad and Asher.
And Leah's reaction is all about status. She says, the women will call me happy. It's about what the neighbors think.
It's all about external validation. So now you have this house full of 4 women, all these kids, one very passive husband, and everyone is just miserable and competing.
And just when you think it cannot get any weirder, we get the Mandrake incident.
Yeah, this is where the story takes a turn into something that feels like folklore, but it's deeply rooted in the botany of the region.
So set the scene. It's the wheat harvest, and Leah's son Reuben finds these mandrakes. I think most of us just think of the screaming Harry Potter plants. What are we actually talking about here?
Well, the Mandragora officinarum is a real plant. It's a type of nightshade.
Yeah.
And its root, it has this long taproot that often splits, so it vaguely looks like a little human body.
Like a torso and legs.
Exactly. And because of that shape, Ancient cultures believed it worked by sympathetic magic. If it looks like a person, it helps you make a person. It was seen as a powerful fertility aid, an aphrodisiac.
So Reuben brings these things home, Rachel sees them, and she has to have them.
She's desperate. The surrogate plan didn't really fix her heart, so now she thinks this magic root will be the solution.
But Leah's response is just dripping with bitterness. She says, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?"
That line, taking away my husband, it's just heartbreaking. But then they make a deal.
And this deal is so revealing. Rachel basically says, "Give me the roots and you can sleep with Jacob tonight."
Think about that trade. She's trading the reality of intimacy with her husband for the illusion of fertility from a plant. She values the magic object more than the relationship.
So Leah essentially has to hire her own husband for the night. The text says she goes out to meet him and says, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you." It's so transactional and cold.
It really is. But here's the great irony, and the text just puts it right there for you to see. Rachel gets the mandrakes. Leah gets the night with Jacob. Who gets pregnant?
Leah does.
Leah does. The fertility superdrug completely fails Rachel. But Leah, who gave up the magic plant, is the one who conceives. And the text makes a point to say, God listened to Leah.
That seems really significant, that God listened to her.
It is. It suggests she finally turned to God instead of plant. Rachel is still trying to manipulate the outcome with botany, while Leah, perhaps in her desperation, prays. The text is reinforcing that life is a gift from God, not something you can control with a scheme.
But then eventually the focus shifts back to Rachel. We get verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel.
And that word remembered zakar in Hebrew, we have to be careful with it. It doesn't mean God had a brain fart and forgot she existed.
Right, like he found her file behind the celestial filing cabinet?
No, not at all. In the Bible, when God remembers, it means it's time to act. He remembered Noah and sent the wind. Here, he remembers Rachel, and it's time for him to fulfill his plan for her. The time for action has arrived.
And she gives birth to Joseph, finally. But even in this moment of victory, it's complicated. She names him Joseph, which means, may he add.
It's a prayer for another one. Her first thought isn't thank you. Her first thought is more.
That's the human condition right there, isn't it? The goalpost just always moves.
It always moves. It's the end of her social shame, her reproach, but it shows you her heart is still hungry.
Okay, so Joseph's birth is a huge turning point. The baby wars kind of die down, and now we move into the business wars. Jacob wants to go home.
He's done his time. 14 years of labor as a bride price. He wants his family, his life. But his father-in-law, Laban, is a shrewd operator. He knows Jacob is the reason he's been so successful.
Laban says it himself. "I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He knows Jacob is his golden goose.
So he asked Jacob to name his price to stay. And Jacob makes his proposal that sounds, on the surface, like a terrible deal for himself.
It sounds crazy. He says, "I'll keep working for you. Just give me all the spotted, speckled, and dark-colored sheep and goats."
Right. And you have to understand, most sheep in that region are solid white. Most goats are solid black or brown. The speckled ones are genetic outliers. It's a tiny percentage.
So Laban hears this, and he must be thinking, what a sucker.
He agrees immediately. But then he cheats. That same day, he goes through all the flocks, pulls out every single speckled and spotted animal.
He removes the breeding stock.
He removes the breeding stock
Yeah.
and sends them 3 days' journey away with his own sons. He leaves Jacob with only solid-colored animals, thinking it's now impossible for him to breed the very wages he was promised.
He's trying to make sure Jacob gets nothing.
Exactly. And this brings us to maybe the most bizarre part of the whole chapter, Jacob's peeled sticks.
This part always trips people up. He takes these sticks, peels stripes in the bark, and puts them in the watering troughs where the animals mate.
Yeah.
And the text says it worked. The flocks started bearing striped and speckled offspring. No, I have to push back. That's not how genetics works.
You're absolutely right. Scientifically, it's nonsense. Peeling sticks doesn't change DNA. It's a folk belief, a form of sympathetic magic. The idea that what you see during conception affects the outcome.
So what's going on here? Is the Bible just endorsing bad science?
Well, there are 2 layers to it. First, Jacob might have been doing good animal husbandry without realizing it. We know about recessive genes. He was also separating the strong animals from the weak ones. So he might have been isolating the carriers of the speckled gene by pure instinct.
Well, thinking it was the magic sticks doing the work.
That's the naturalistic explanation. But the text itself gives us a theological one a chapter later. Jacob tells his wives he had a dream where God showed him that the male goats mating were already striped and spotted.
So God is basically saying, Jacob, you think it's your clever stick trick. No, I'm the one doing this.
Precisely. God is overriding the normal laws of probability to bless Jacob. Laban took away the visible spotted animals, but God made sure the hidden recessive genes came out at a miraculous rate. The sticks were Jacob's superstition. The outcome was God's providence.
That's a critical distinction. He was blessed despite his method, not because of it.
And despite Laban's cheating, it becomes this massive transfer of wealth. Jacob gets the strong flocks, Laban gets the weak ones, and Jacob becomes exceedingly prosperous.
So let's zoom out, because the result is a massive family and great wealth. But the road to get there was just a catastrophe.
A total mess.
You have a family founded on rivalry, women trading sex for magic plants, a father cheating his son-in-law, a son-in-law using folk magic.
If you saw this family on the news today, you would think they were about to completely implode.
So why is this story in the Bible? I mean, this is the origin of the 12 tribes of Israel. These aren't just random people. Why build your holy nation on such a crooked foundation?
And that is the ultimate so what of this whole deep dive, isn't it? The story forces you to abandon any idea that God's plan depends on our goodness. God doesn't wait for Rachel and Leah to be nice to each other before he builds the nation.
He's not waiting for Jacob to be perfectly honest before he makes him rich.
Not at all. He works through the mess. He works in the mess.
Yeah.
The tribes are born and the wealth is gained because God made a promise to Abraham, and he's going to keep it even if he has to drag these scheming, flawed people over the finish line.
That's actually kind of a relief, because if God required perfect theology and perfect relationships from us before he could work, we'd all be in trouble.
We'd all be disqualified. But look what he produces. He takes the jealousy of these two sisters and creates the 12 tribes. He takes the greed of Laban and Jacob and creates the economic engine for that nation. He weaves their sin right into his salvation story.
It really reframes how you look at your own life. You might feel like you're in the middle of a mandrake incident right now. You know, desperate, trying to make deals, relying on the wrong thing.
Or you might be peeling sticks. You might be pouring all your energy into some strategy, some plan, thinking this is the thing that'll save you, when really God is quietly working behind the scenes to bless you in a way you can't even see yet.
A provocative thought, for sure. That we think we're the authors of our own success, but maybe we're just holding the sticks while God manages the flock.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, there is so much to chew on there. From the Nutsi tablets to sheep genetics to the theology of broken families, Genesis 30 is definitely not just a boring list of names.
No, it's a mirror.
And we'd love to hear what you think. Where in your own life might you be relying on mandrakes or sticks instead of just trusting the outcome? Something to mull over.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
See you next time.